I am super excited to welcome my dear friend, the Congresswoman Pramila Jeyapaul. She is the state of Washington's 7th Congressional District Representative. She is the first Indian American woman to serve in the House of Representatives. I just learned that she is one of only 11 immigrants to serve in Congress. And I got to tell you, I've known her for years, so I knew her as a badass civil rights activist when she was in Seattle fighting for immigrants' rights, building a movement, really, with One America. This is a woman who has immense heart and courage. And back in June, when the Trump administration was found to be separating children from their parents at the border, she was one of the first to go down to the border and investigate and bear witness to what was happening. And she called us up and said, this is a time for moral action. We cannot sit by. Even though Congress is refusing to provide oversight, we are going to take to the streets. And we had an amazing day at the end of June where in 750 cities around the country, people mobilized to save the soul of our country. And that is who Pramila Jeyapaul is. She just is returning from a trip to the border this past weekend. And for any of you who haven't seen it, I would urge you to pick up the New York Review of Books. She wrote a really bracing piece yesterday on the moral imagination of immigration. She's holding down the fort, and she's now the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, 90-member big and strong. Please welcome my dear, dear friend, Congresswoman Pramila Jeyapaul, in conversation with Dara from the Vox.
Afternoon, folks. Good afternoon, Congresswoman.
Good afternoon, Leadership Conference. How are you? I heard you had an amazing day, and we promise the last session will be good.
I want to know, can you talk to us about what you saw in Tijuana over the weekend and what you did in Tijuana over the weekend?
Yeah, so as Vanita said, and I just want to start by saying how incredibly fortunate the Leadership Conference is to have Vanita Gupta as the head of it. She is just phenomenal. She has been fighting her whole life, getting people to do all kinds of things that people never thought were possible. And I just wish she was still the Attorney General for Civil Rights. That would be an incredible thing, but I'm glad she's here. And I really want to thank all of you at the Leadership Conference for the work that you've done for so long in creating the kind of coalition that has real power in fighting for civil, immigrant, and human rights. So give yourselves a round of applause for that, because I think that is really important. So I have obviously been fighting for immigrant rights my whole life, and was out front on the family separations piece. I've been following very closely what's been happening at the southern border. About a week ago, when I saw that they were tear gassing mothers and children, I felt I really needed to go down to the border and see for myself what happened. And so I flew down on Friday night. We crossed over into Tijuana on Saturday. We spent the whole day on Saturday, first at the plaza where most of the caravan and the asylum seekers and the folks in the caravan had gathered. They were being moved the very day that we were there, which was also AMLO's inauguration as president. So it's a really interesting time on a number of levels. But they had just set up a new shelter called El Barrital, which is about 20 or 25 minutes away. And so we drove to El Barrital. It's set up for about 8,000 people to be there. There were about 1,500 when I went. Most of them are still being transferred. We spent a lot of time in the family part of the shelter, talking to families, a father whose son has cerebral palsy, who has literally been on the road from Honduras. Most of the people we talked to were from Honduras, but not all. And it's important that people know there's a big group of Cameroonians and Haitians who are there. And I heard a particularly harrowing story from a 17-year-old who had traveled with her mother from Haiti to Venezuela, Venezuela to Colombia, Colombia to Panama, Panama to Ecuador, Ecuador to Mexico, an 8-month trip, including slashing their way through forests in Latin America. And so just so that there's a context, but the majority of asylum seekers that I spoke with were from Honduras. And the stories were as horrific as you might imagine. People fleeing, not seeking the American dream, just fleeing a reign of terror. Women whose husbands had been murdered, children who had actually seen their father killed, a pregnant woman, 7.5 months pregnant, who had traveled with her, with her partner because her ex-partner had threatened to kill her, and people really fleeing the most horrendous situations. And not to get long into history, but the history of the United States' lack of involvement in really holding the Honduran government responsible since the coup happened, I think is something to be considered. And so we spoke to the folks at the shelter. Then we went to a women's shelter, Madre. We also went to a shelter that holds unaccompanied minors. And everything is horrendous, but I think it's particularly awful for the unaccompanied minors who are literally not allowed to get on the list, which is a very strange thing that is outsourced basically to a quasi-governmental organization plus the Mexican authorities, and they keep this informal list. There's a book. We went to visit the table.
Have they fixed, I was there like 6 weeks ago and it didn't look like the book was much longer for this world. Is it a new book? Is it the same book?
It's the same book, but it is just, people just show up at the table and they get a number. So you can imagine the pieces of paper with the number on them, how much they sell for. There are reports of women having to perform sexual favors to get their name in the book. And that is the process that the United States government has basically allowed to happen or outsourced. So when a name is called, then the person gets to come and present themselves at the border. But if you're an unaccompanied minor, you are not allowed on the list. And if you put yourself on the list, then you are immediately turned over to DIF, which is the Mexican authorities responsible for unaccompanied children. And you never get to the border. And so we went to a lot of these places, and then I ended the day at around 5 or 6 o'clock. I had gone to visit with Al Otro Lado, an amazing organization that works with asylum seekers, run by a former federal defender who used to work in Montgomery, Alabama. She's tough, and she really knows what she's doing. And I accompanied a group of 5 asylum seekers, 2 unaccompanied minors, 1 mother and her 9-year-old child, and a young man, about 26 or 27, who had been beaten in Honduras and suffered serious medical conditions. And they were initially turned away at the border, and through a lot of convincing and a lot of talking and mentioning that I'm a member of Congress and we appropriate dollars for the Customs and Border Protection, and that it is in our laws that if you present seeking asylum, you have a fear of being killed or persecuted, that you have the right to a credible fear hearing. That is absolutely legal. And we were finally able to get them in, and thanks to a really compassionate border chief as well. So we were finally able to get them all in. But that is not how it should be. People should be able to come and seek asylum. And for everything that the White House says, I don't need to tell the people in this room, we are not actually a particularly outrageously generous country in terms of asylum seekers. We are 50th in the world in terms of the numbers of asylum seekers that we allow in compared to population GDP. So what the Trump administration has done is basically cut everything to a trickle, stopped the ability for people to actually come and apply for asylum. And not everybody down there is an asylum seeker. There are a lot of economic migrants. And so it is unfortunate that we have stopped the processing so that the differentiation can be made, and people who really have this deep fear of being killed would not be able to go through that processing. So it was a very emotional time. In some ways the stories were horrific, but we had just had the family separation too. So it's terrible that the bar has been set so high for horrificness.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that, because what you're describing is not just a policy challenge, it's also kind of a political or organizing challenge that all of this is happening, by design or by neglect, off of U.S. soil, outside of, what people are going to see on, cable news B-roll. How do you make things that are happening outside the U.S. And officially not think the U.S. government is even actively doing, just kind of shutting their eyes to, seem urgent and create a movement around that in the way you would with something like family separation, where it was so obvious what was being done and what could be done to stop it?
Well, that's why I went down, and I think that's why we have to keep talking about this and we have to put the stories out there, because I do have a platform, being a member of Congress, and I can use it to tell the stories. So we interviewed, we spent hours and hours interviewing people, live streaming what we were doing, writing about it. We'll have an op-ed coming out on it. I hope to be able to talk about it a lot more in this way to tell the actual stories. And we just have to recognize that this isn't actually something that's happening outside of the US, it is on our border. And yes, we're using all kinds of technicalities to prevent people from getting to the border, but we are signatories to international human rights treaties that require us to allow people to seek asylum. And we have domestic law that allows us to do that. So I think we just have to make this relevant, and I'm also somebody who thinks that all these issues around the world are deeply relevant to who we are as a country, and we don't live in an isolated world, we live in a global world, and so people in the United States do sometimes have a challenge thinking about everywhere around the country, around the world, but I think this is right here on our border, and people need to be paying attention to it, but with our narrative, not with the narrative of Fox News and the constant lies and falsehoods, baseless slander that we should just call out, laugh at, and refuse to accept.
This kind of leads into the essay that you wrote for the New York Review of Books, that published over the weekend, on kind of the need to articulate a new moral imagination. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, independently of or without reference to the kind of narrative that we've been getting from the administration for the last couple of years?
Yeah, the article came out of, there was a New York Times cover story, New York Times Magazine cover story on immigration about a month ago that Robert Draper wrote, and he profiled me as part of that story. And in the story, there was a line where I said, we need a new moral imagination on immigration, and we have to assert it. And so the editor of the New York Review of Books emailed me and said, could you write a piece for me? He said 1,600 words, it's 3,000 words, but I thought that was pretty good. And so I spent a lot of time writing this because I really think we have been on the defensive with a president who has no regard for the truth and has used immigration and immigrants as a political football in a way that no other president has. Because it's not that some of the things that have been happening started with Trump. They have been around. I have worked on detention for a long time. I have great love for President Obama. I miss him deeply, and I had to call him out on a number of things that happened around immigration. It was necessary. But Republican and Democratic presidents until Trump did still hew to the idea that immigration has been something that is important to who we are as a country, important to our values, and important to continue to uphold. This president has departed from that completely. And he has decided that his political calculus is based on the ability to keep immigrants out there as someone to blame. And it's really part of the reason Leadership Conference is so important and the coalition work is so important. Because if we get into a hierarchy of oppressions, that is playing into their hands. That is what they want, is to be able to blame immigrants for their inability to provide health care or take care of education or have opportunity for kids to go to public schools because they're cutting all the funding. So let's just be clear about where the blame lies. And I think that the framework has to be one that is based on a dualistic past, two dueling ideas in our immigration policy and history. One that has really embraced bigotry and racism, and the other that has been very generous to people who are coming from around the world. Both things are true, and the battle gets fought every century, if not multiple times in a century, with every new group that comes. And so I think we have to hold both of those things, and at the same time recognize that unlike any country in the world, we really do have an identity that is linked to immigration, and that is part of our history. It is how the country has been built, sometimes extremely unjustly, and often by taking something from somebody that was here, but also part of who we are. And so that moral center of leadership, of identity, and of our future has to be a part of our policymaking. And then you look at the economic needs of a country whose demographics is aging, workforce needs that are necessary for the country to continue to grow, and you think about family as the bedrock. You know, this ridiculous idea of chain migration, or somehow that we're not getting the best and the brightest because of family immigration, is absurd. Family immigration has been the bedrock of our country, and if you look at it, it has brought us strivers of all levels, of all skills. And it's not that you bring in family and they sit at home and do nothing and take benefits. All those members of your family that have been brought here have helped build the country, have helped take care of grandchildren, have helped take care of parents, but also have filled these job classes that are necessary across the country. And so really thinking about policy from the standpoint of we've been cowards in not addressing immigration policy, not fixing it, not making it so that it actually meets the needs of our country, but also so that it hews to the values of who we are. And so that's really the framework that's laid out in the piece. And I say in there that it's really important for Democrats to stop being afraid of this issue, to take hold of it, to call out lies where there are lies, and to continue to fight for real humane policy.
So, you know, the thing about immigration policy, unlike a lot of other policy areas, is that it really is, you know, pretty much just through the aperture of federal policy. There are some things that can happen at the state and local level, but really so much of what you're talking about is something that right now is in the hands of the Trump administration. So what for the next 2 years are the opportunities that you're seeing as a member of Congress and as a movement leader to articulate this vision while there's still somebody else holding the reins?
Well, come January, guess what happens? We take the majority. And I feel like Aretha Franklin should start playing right now. But it's true. We will have the opportunity to have oversight hearings, to pass bills that renew and restore our hope in rational immigration policy, to message around what is really true and what is false. And I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and I'm really looking forward to that opportunity because I think that we need to take this back. We need to be on the offense. When I've gone on Fox News, I sometimes just laugh. It's a really good strategy because they say the most ridiculous things. We shouldn't always act like we have to answer them. We can literally just laugh and call out the lies. So I think we will have the chance to do that, and at the same time, I think we will also, hopefully in the first 100 days, pass a DREAM Act, a Clean DREAM Act, pass TPS, address the family separations. You're right, Dara, that some of this is administrative, and so it's difficult for us to roll it all back quickly, but we can certainly put real limits on what the administration can do. We can have oversight hearings. We can tell people what's happening. The millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars we're spending on troops being down at the border when they should have been having, Thanksgiving dinner with their families instead of just setting them down there for nothing. So I think that this is our chance to put forward the vision of what we really see America to be, and to remind ourselves that there would be, that there is no future without all of us, black, brown, and white, coming together, and we can't allow this president to continue to use this issue to divide us. It's just, it has to stop. And so, but we have to be brave about it. We have to be courageous, and we have to just refuse to accept what's handed to us.
I'm glad that you mentioned the point about being courageous, because the other thing I want to talk about is, the lead up to the census in 2020 and the fight that, you've been waging with a lot of other organizations, many of them in this room, to stop the administration from asking about citizenship on the census. How do you, fight that and try to prevent the chilling effect that that's likely to have on immigrant families, while encouraging the idea, because it's so crucial to the actual functioning of the census, that people really should stand up and be counted and shouldn't be afraid and should be courageous?
I think it's all about organizing and about how we're going to fight the citizenship question on the census. The Leadership Conference is a leader in that fight. We also, I should just mention, we have the most progressive House in the history of the country. And we now have 94, 95 members of the Progressive Caucus. 40% of House Democrats are progressives, and I'm proud to be a co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. And so we have a new opportunity, I think, to address the actual citizenship question in the census. If we're not successful with that, then there are some other tactics around how we ensure that everyone can be counted, how we, stop a scarlet letter from being on somebody if they answer, and those tactics are all being developed right now. But federal dollars depend on the census, as you know, and so it is incredibly important that we get people to answer. And when I'm on the budget committee, and I tried to pass an amendment that would take the citizenship question out, and I said to my colleagues, you guys are going to lose money on the other side. I mean, Republicans, their districts are going to lose money too, because they have a lot of immigrants, and if they're not counted, they're not going to get money either. But politics overrode everything else, and so they didn't vote for the amendment. But we will continue to push, I think, at the federal level to get the citizenship question out, and then we got to do a lot of organizing to make sure that we are helping to reach out to different ethnic communities through churches, through synagogues, through mosques, all the different ways in which we can reach people and really make sure that they understand how important this census is, and how all of our resources for the things we care about, healthcare, education, everything, depends on an accurate census and everyone being counted.
So while I would love to have us leave with just putting pressure on everybody in this room to go out and make sure everyone stands up and is counted, I know that we're the last thing of the day, so I want to give everyone a little more of a positive note to end on. So what are you most excited for in the coming couple of years?
Well, look, I think that the times when we have made progress in this country on big issues, civil rights, voting rights, whatever the issues are the times when we've also seen backlash. After segregation, school segregation was ended, you saw the kind of backlash that came back, the people that tried to stop that from still being implemented in spite of the court's rulings. And you have seen that every time. And so I take hope in the idea that when you see this kind of backlash and you feel like we're taking steps backward, that you actually look at that as that moral arc of the universe bending towards justice, as the theme of the conference is, that is part of making progress. And maybe I'll just end with, has anybody read the Book of Joy, Story of Joy, or Book of Joy? It's a conversation between Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama, who I had the incredible honor to meet several times actually in the last year and spend time with. And in there, I've always described myself as an optimist, but in there, Archbishop Tutu says, there's a real difference between hope and optimism. Optimism is created. It's ephemeral. It's somewhat transient. If it's created, it can be taken away. Whereas hope is something that comes from deep inside of you. Hope is something that is here and here and here. And nobody can take it away because it is too strong of a force within us. And so I think that in this room, we have a group of people who are hopists, not optimists, and I'm calling myself a hopist because I really believe that we're on the precipice of some enormous changes for good in this country. But don't think it's not going to be a fight. But everybody in this room has fought before. We will fight before. We will fight again, and we will win. Thank you. All right, thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody.